Hey everybody, so we were finishing up our discussion on economic geography, and we left off talking about why, uh, you know, all of the industrial facilities, the big manufacturers, the big employers left the American manufacturing belt, which we today call the Rust Belt. And a lot of it has to do with those factors that we talked about: the cost of your the cost of manufacturing cost. In the 1960s and 1970s, the United States passed a lot of environmental laws, which made it more difficult for manufacturers to operate the way that they always had. It became cheaper for them to move to other countries that didn't have such um, stringent economic punishments for being pollutive. For example, places like China, right? Places like Mexico didn't have the same environmental laws, so companies could simply sort of ship their pollution to another country, and that country would eagerly accept the pollution and the negative the negative environmental impact of the business because of the economic benefits it was getting from all of these new jobs. In addition to that, there were many states up in the Northeast and the Upper Midwest that had become Union states, and in the 1960s and particularly the 1970s, unions were extremely aggressive in raising the cost of labor. And at a certain point, many of these companies, which had been working with unions for decades, just simply said, we're not going to pay any more for this labor, and we're going to go to a state, which could have been one of the other states in the United States where labor was cheaper, or it could have gone to another country that didn't have unions. Again, we saw a lot of car companies begin relocating elsewhere in the country or elsewhere in the world. And you saw manufacturing over time just go overseas. Americans were aware of this in the 1980s. And of course, there was a pushback against it. But at the same time, Americans became very used to and almost addicted to the idea that we love getting cheap consumer goods. And that's an important question to sort of keep in your mind. Think about what happened when you watched the Pruitt-Igoe myth. You had migration to the inner part of the city of St. Louis in it was around the 1950s, and at the same time, you had lots and lots of factory owners and jobs and businesses that were leaving their job, or that were leaving their facilities. Sometimes these old factories, sometimes a business wanted a new factory or a new facility. Some of them went overseas, but some of them just went out to the suburbs. Why did they do that? It goes back to the costs. If we wanted to rebuild or retool or build a completely new facility, where is the land most available? Well, it's not in the center of the city. There's not a ton of available land in the center of the city, right? In the central business district, right? Whereas out in the suburbs, we can find some place that hasn't been developed yet and build a huge facility out there. So land was more available. It was also cheaper out there in the suburbs, right? Because there's a greater supply of it. And they learned really quickly on that even if they moved out to a suburb which maybe didn't have the big economic or the big labor market, a lot of times their labor force would move to the suburbs with them. So they never experienced a labor shortage. We call that spatial mismatch, if you remember from the Pruitt-Igoe myth. People were moving to the inner part of the city and looking for jobs, and the jobs had left. They had either gone overseas or they had gone out to the suburbs. And it was the first time in America that had really happened. Immigrants and low-wage, low-skilled workers had always come to the city and had always been able to find manufacturing jobs in the factories. But after World War II, that was not the case anymore. Now that thing that we saw happening in St. Louis was happening in towns all across the Midwest, and over time throughout the 1980s, that brings us to the modern Rust Belt, which is city after city after city after city across the Midwest, the Great Lakes, and the Northeast, where the businesses just left. And when the factories left, obviously they took their jobs with them, and it sort of sent these cities on a downward spiral. And when the factories left, they took the jobs with them, and so all of a sudden you had a great deal of people left behind who weren't making as much money as they were before, if they were employed at all. And those people who weren't making as much money before are going to pay less in taxes. Without the factory there, the factory's not paying any taxes anymore. And a great you saw people start to leave the cities. In the Pruitt-Igoe myth, we saw that the city of St. Louis around the 1940s had 800,000 people in it, and today it has less than 300,000 people in it. So these cities have contracted a great deal. When that happens, you see things generally get worse in a city, because think of all the things that the city pays for with taxes, right? It pays for schools with taxes, and if taxes go down, schools generally don't get better. It pays for police forces with taxes. It pays for fire departments with taxes. It pays for filling the potholes with taxes. It pays for the water upgrades to the water system with taxes. All of these things require taxes, and with the jobs gone, and with the you generally saw the decline of these cities, and in general lowering of life quality for these folks. Now, bringing me back to that question I asked a few minutes ago, people were angry at these companies, many of them American companies, who quote unquote screwed over American workers by sending their manufacturing facilities either to a different state, but usually out of the country. People were angry, and the whole Buy American, and you didn't see, but they said the Buy American movement was sort of born in the 1970s and 1980s. People encouraging other people to, buy American products. Why? Well, because American products mean American jobs, which sounds great. Why wouldn't people want to buy American products and keep Americans and employed and keep American neighborhoods strong? It sounds great. The problem is it's more expensive. And, if I want to buy a t-shirt, and a t-shirt costs me $30 because it's made in an American factory, as opposed to, it cost me $4 because it's made in a Burmese factory, that I get at Walmart. Americans have become addicted to cheap goods, and we'll touch on that again in a second, so don't forget that. Some of these Rust Belt cities are in bad shape, and others of them have been really amazing at reinventing themselves. This is a picture of Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh, of course, was devastated by how the American steel industry basically no longer exists. It was, of course, a steel town, hence the Pittsburgh Steelers. Pittsburgh has completely reinvented itself. It started off by reinventing itself as a medical services town, but quickly diversified into lots of different industries. It built a new entertainment district. It built a new baseball stadium. It has awesome colleges, and it's really a success story for how some cities in the what's called the Rust Belt have really sort of given themselves a rebirth. Grand Rapids, Michigan is another one. It's the nation's largest manufacturer of office furniture. So there's still some manufacturing there. Columbus, Buffalo, also great places to great success stories in terms of cities being reborn, in terms of the Rust Belt. Other cities, not so successful. Detroit, you feel bad for Detroit. It is really just had bad luck after bad luck after bad luck. Really horrible leadership, and everything they have tried in Detroit to get that city turned around has just been unsuccessful. St. Louis is another one. You guys know that I grew up around St. Louis, and I can tell you that I remember growing up around there, and it seemed like every 5 or 6 years they would have a new plan for revitalizing the downtown area. And they would come in and they'd spend $100 million on this, and then it'd be $100 million on that. And it's none of it has really worked. Part of what hasn't worked for St. Louis is the crime is absolutely horrible in St. Louis. It's the murder capital of the United States most years. So obviously, if I were going to relocate a facility to someplace, that would be something that I would consider. Right? Do I expect my employees to work in a place that is known as the murder capital of anything? And the answer is probably no. Chicago is another city that has had to deal with the same issues, not to the extent of St. Louis or Detroit for sure, but they lost a lot of industry. They're also the biggest city in the Midwest, so they still have a great deal of industry, but they've lost a lot of it since the heyday of the Rust Belt. But they also have really, really bad crime and a long history of really corrupt leadership, which has made Chicago sort of lag behind the other Rust Belt cities that have sort of come back to life. So last thing I want to ask you on this is because in the past couple of weeks, we've been dealing with this coronavirus thing. And one of the things that we've run into is the fact that we get all of our pharmaceuticals from China. And a couple of weeks ago, people were very worried that we weren't going to be able to get the pharmaceuticals that we needed because China either wasn't going to be able to produce them at the rate that we needed, and there were some in the Chinese government that had threatened that even if they had what we needed, they wouldn't sell them to us as sort of a way of retaliating. And so let me ask you this question. This is what I pose to you. At what point are all of the cheap goods that we buy, the $4 t-shirts, the $50 tennis shoes, the blue jeans that we can get for, $30 at Walmart, and the only reason we can get all that stuff so cheaply is because it's made overseas, and where the costs are lower. It's the only reason we can get that stuff. And even if you are even if you are buying your stuff from a specialty store, if you're buying a pair of jeans that cost $100 or more, it's very likely that your jeans cost, in terms of production, the exact same as the $30 jeans from Walmart. You're just paying a whole lot more in profit, because the jeans were probably still made in the same factory in China or Burma or Myanmar or wherever you got them from. At what point is it worth it for Americans to say, I'm willing to pay more for all of the products that I buy? I'm willing to pay more for my toaster. I'm willing to pay more for my shoes. I'm willing to pay more for my t-shirts and my toothbrushes and my dog food, which, by the way, is also a lot of times made overseas. I'm willing to pay more for these things for a couple reasons. One, because it's going to mean that Americans are going to be able to have jobs. It's going to mean good things for a lot of these old manufacturing towns, where some of these industries would thrive. And also, it's going to mean that come the next global pandemic, where we're worried about getting something like jeans or pharmaceuticals or any of this stuff, we don't have to worry about another country holding it over our heads. We could be sort of self-sufficient. Obviously, that's going to cost more, but there's a benefit to having access to that stuff yourself. My question to you is to think about is, at what point do we consider that? And I'm going to leave it there. We'll talk about that next time, and you all have a great day, and we'll see you next time, okay? Bye-bye.